Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar on the Respectful Workplace Building Blocks for Preventing Harassment and Toxic Behaviors. This free webinar is available exclusively for our customers enrolled in our subscription services. I'm Leon Frierson, the Publications Coordinator for Personnel Concepts, and I'm joined by my co moderator, Rosie Merlon, who serves as our regulatory researcher.
Hello to all of our listeners. Our guest speaker today is Jessica Merle. Jessica practices corporate and employment law and is barred in the state of Illinois, Georgia, and Washington, D.C. Ms. Merle received her JD from the University of Illinois, graduating cum laude and receiving the law school's highest merit scholarship. She has received awards for her excellence in legal writing, legal analysis, legal advocacy, and her teaching skills. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Rosie and Leon. I'm really looking forward to discussing today's topic because I think it's not only very timely, but it's also really important to the well-being and productivity of both the employer and employee.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking forward to discussing it with you. Today's agenda focuses on providing an overview of key training strategies that can help mitigate workplace harassment and toxic behaviors. We will begin with a discussion on why fostering a respectful workplace should be a priority for employers. We will then talk about sensitivity training, workplace civility, and inclusion and diversity training. At the end, we'll address questions submitted by our listeners.
And the format for today's webinar features a series of questions that Rosie and I will be asking to Jessica regarding respectful workplaces. Before we begin, I want to invite everyone in attendance to submit any questions you may have during the presentation by using the Ask Question feature in GoToWebinar. You can also ask questions in the question window. Most questions will be saved for the end of today's session, but those that are relevant to the subtopic being discussed will be posed where appropriate. Also, Jessica has received your questions that you posed in pre-registration, so thank you for those. Then at the end of the session, you'll have an opportunity to use the raise hand feature in GoToWebinar to pose a question directly to our guest speaker. With that, let's get started with today's presentation.
Jessica, could you talk a little bit about why employers should be concerned about fostering a respectful workplace?
Absolutely. And I think that undervaluing workplace civility is one of the reasons that employers are encountering right now heightened issues with harassment and other toxic behaviors. So to jump right in 2016, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, as you all know it, released a very comprehensive report. And the report was the first of its kind, and it looked at harassment in the workplace. The report revealed that toxic workplace culture extends far beyond what is considered actionable under the law. And it shows as well that workplace incivility often acts as a gateway drug, if you will, to workplace harassment. And that comes directly from the EEOC commissioner. Now, approximately 1/3 of private sector and 1/2 of public sector complaints that the EEOC looks at each year relate to harassment. So when we review the totality of harassment-based claims, we see that harassment can really take on many types of discrimination and issues. So we have the traditional sex, race, disability. Those form the areas of most complaints. And what we see also is, again, with the toxic workplace being a gateway drug, as we see that employers who don't actively foster respectful workplaces or civil workplaces have a far greater likelihood of facing such harassment and facing such discrimination claims. So to go through it here at the very beginning, let's look at what toxic culture is versus what is respectful culture. So toxic workplace culture, we have more cases of poor mental health. That's a big one. We have higher rates of absenteeism. As I just mentioned, we have increased claims of discrimination and increased claims of harassment, especially when it comes to race, sex, and disability. We have together with absenteeism, we have greater employee turnover, and of course, the bottom line, we have lowered productivity. Now, on the other hand, what is a respectful workplace? That sounds easy to define, but it's not. So a respectful workplace is one where all employees have positive experiences. And that does mean all employees, from managers down to assistants. We see that respectful workplaces have a much heightened team spirit. We're going to talk about that a little later when we discuss the inclusivity training. We see that respectful workplaces have better customer engagement, and of course, they have increased productivity and performance. Now, cumulatively, toxic culture, if it's left to fester, it can lead to an increase, like I said, of harassment claims. But even when those incidents, when they don't give rise to a claim, employers still spend approximately 7 weeks a year, or 13% of their annual working time, dealing with them.
Thank you for that, Jessica, and thank you for breaking down the toxic and respectful workplaces. Now, you were just speaking of harassment claims, and just so our listeners have a frame of reference, could you give us an overview of how harassment is defined under the law?
Sure. So we have a few applicable rules and regulations. They really are the same ones that we go over in all of these webinars, and it's great to remind ourselves of what they are. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, that's the big one. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now together, those give us a definition of harassment. So the law defines harassment as we see it there on your screen. One, a situation where an employee must endure offensive conduct as a condition of continued employment, or where conduct is so severe and is so pervasive so as to create a work environment that no reasonable person would not consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. Now, of course, the law also prohibits harassment against persons who file discrimination charges, who testify in discrimination matters, participate in investigations, etc. So it must be noted, as I said, that not all of the claims that are reported to the EEOC do give rise to an actual actionable offense. On the other hand, nearly 90% of harassment claims, they're never brought before the EEOC. And 3 out of 4 victims of harassment don't even ever report the issue to a supervisor. Instead, where a workplace is toxic, what we see a common response is to avoid the harasser, deny the harasser, ignore or just downplay the issue. And the reasons behind this failure to report are what you would expect. They're driven by fears of retaliation, both in a social context and an employment context. They're driven by fears of disbelief, and they're driven by fears of inaction. And again, the statistics show that those fears are well founded. 75% of employees who do report issues report secondary issues of retaliation, of indifference, or trivialization.
It seems that this is a very pervasive issue. What steps is the EEOC taking to address harassment?
So as I mentioned, the EEOC did this great cumulative report in 2016, and from then the various steps, various things, various suggestions are coming from the EEOC on how to deal with its findings. So one of the main things, as we see here on the screen, is that we see traditionally our compliance-based initiatives to address harassment have been to avoid legal liability, right? They've been to address the root problem, they haven't been to address the root problem, and that's what the initiatives that we're going to talk today are looking at to do. And by shifting the mentality underlying such training, so by moving from this idea of only avoiding legal liability, but to addressing the root problem, the EEOC hopes that employers will move towards a more holistic approach, and that will give better statistics, that will result in reduced harassment and discrimination claims.
Okay, thank you for that, Jessica. Okay, so we have our first poll question here, and it is currently, what training does your workplace provide to employees? Mark all that apply. Okay, so we see some votes coming in, so we'll leave this open for a few more seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and close this poll. And let's share our results. Okay, so anti-harassment and anti-discrimination are definitely at the top of that list. Thank
Yeah,
you, everyone.
so thank you, Rosie, and all the audience for participating. And like she said, it does look like most employers are already training on anti-harassment and anti-discrimination, Jessica. But could you talk to us and give us an overview of sensitivity, civility, and inclusion training and what that looks like for employers?
Absolutely. And these numbers from the poll, what we see is exactly what we would have imagined to see. Like I said, most companies are focusing only on anti-harassment, on anti-discrimination training, but these other sensitivity training, civility training, and inclusivity training are really great additional tools to add to create this more holistic approach. And we're going to talk about all three of them in this webinar. So the first one is sensitivity training. Now, sensitivity training is dating back quite a ways. It's one of the earliest forms of training that we have, and it dates back to 1946 when psychologist Kurt Lewin provided training for the Connecticut State Interracial Commission. Now, over the years, the concept has undergone several incarnations. So it went from multicultural training, which is what we saw there in Connecticut, then it went to diversity training, to inclusivity training, and more recently to respectful and mindfulness training. So a big part of sensitivity training is mindfulness training. And at its core, the modern workplace sensitivity training seeks to ensure that all employees feel respected. It seeks to ensure that all employees also respect the ideas and opinions of other people. And in short, really we can say it's the golden rule. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's what the sensitivity training seeks to teach. Now, there are a couple types of sensitivity that we need to look at, right? So we have first overt sensitivity. Now, that's very easy to spot. That's things like racial slurs, jokes, homophobia. It's the type of behavior that traditional liability mitigation trainings have sought to curtail. So this type of overt insensitivity, that is what your current anti-harassment, anti-discrimination trainings say don't do. Now, it's the other type of insensitivity that is what we're really looking at here. It's sensitivity that is subtle, that it's unconscious. And this is the type of insensitivity that leads to this toxic workplace permeating before its toxicity and before its damage is realized. Now, insensitivity that's subtle, that's unconscious, it frequently masquerades as humor. And it's really generally not intended to harm or to offend. And let's look at some examples. So if you are, say, at a lunch with a Hindu colleague and you make a joke as to eating a hamburger, right? Everyone at the table may laugh, but it's still not sensitive. Or insinuating, again jokingly, that an African American colleague was only hired to meet the company's diversity goals. Again, masquerading as a joke, it may not be intended to harm or offend. Now, as we can see from those examples, whether the remark is insensitive, actually depends on who the receiving party is. Okay, so a key component of insensitivity training is to teach employees how to analyze if the comment will be well met and if it will be met with a similar humor, or if, on the other hand, it will be construed as rude or as disrespectful. So as we see on the screen, at their core, sensitive workplaces are mindful workplaces. They're environments where employees have carefully thought about their own behaviors, where they've carefully thought about their own personalities. Importantly, where they've identified their own pet peeves and triggers and their own annoyances. So, for example, if an employee finds that it's insensitive that a supervisor doesn't return his phone calls as timely as that employee would like, the employee should consider why this failure to promptly return phone calls actually causes him so much annoyance and should work out a coping strategy. And those are the types of things that mindfulness training, that insensitivity training seeks to address. So in short, mindful employees, they are those employees that have identified their own blind spots, who have identified their own biases, and by learning those, by identifying those, they can adjust for them in their interactions with coworkers and foster a greater mutual respect in the workplace.
Okay, thank you, Jessica, for that. And we have our second poll question here. What is your typical response to workplace incivility? Okay, we'll give our listeners a few more moments to make a selection here. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. And seems like have an informal discussion is at the top of that list.
All right. And obviously, I think it's fair to say that most people have experienced some type of work incivility here, not only just based on the poll, but on our own experience here in general. So, with that being said, Jessica, I'd like to move forward with the presentation. And could you tell us about training employees on civility and how it can help employers in general?
Of course, but before I do that, I want to actually mention that the poll that we just had, like the other poll, the first one, it doesn't surprise me at all. In fact, before I jumped onto this webinar, I was on a web conference with one of my clients where we were going over a report from incivil, or from what was construed as disrespectful behavior. And there are things that employers are not so sure how to handle. It's not traditional harassment, it's not traditional discrimination. So, how do we deal with this? And that's where civility training really comes into play. And in fact, to this particular client, I said, here are the recommendations that the EEOC has right now. Follow them. Have your employees all go through some civility and sensitivity training. So sensitivity training, as I mentioned earlier, is another one of the trainings that the EEOC is strongly urging employers to implement. And to do it before the problem arises or before the problem grows, in a top-down effort to, again, minimize those harassment claims and, again, to foster a more friendly workplace. So civility training, it's important. And the statistics on incivility are staggering, with some reports finding up to 98% of employees reporting having experienced incivility at work. That's almost everyone. And at least half of those employees report that they experience that incivility at least once a week. Now, in addition to other negative repercussions of incivil corporate cultures, workplaces where civility is lacking are exponentially more likely to have both reportable and non-reportable incidents of harassment. That is what the task force and the report from the EEOC found. So instead of having a dialogue about civility before there's incivil behavior, just like sensitivity training, workplace civility training involves looking and addressing the root problem. And again, let's do some definitions. I think first, let's look at what is civil behavior. Now, civil behavior, it shows respect to coworkers. It makes everyone feel respected, it makes everyone feel valued, and it makes no one feel ostracized. It contributes to effective collaboration and effective contribution, especially in the ways we're going to discuss later in this webinar. And yeah, it encourages team collaboration, as you see there. Now, uncivil behavior, incivil behavior, that is behavior that it's berating, it's bullying, it's badgering. But more than that, it's behavior that is simply rude. It's behavior that's loud. It's behavior that is maybe sarcastic. It's behavior that's condescending, that's lacking in good manners, that degrades, humiliates, etc. Right? So if we look further on the next slide, we're going to talk about the 4 cornerstones of civility. What does civility training actually look at? Now, the EEOC task force, which I mentioned quite frequently in this webinar, took a deep look into the root causes of incivil behavior in the workplace. And it found that generally such behavior stems from underlying prejudices against a protected class. Now, what's a protected class? We look back at Title VII, gender, race, disability, etc. Right? So it stems from underlying prejudices, whether they're conscious or subconscious, against a protected class. And now other contributing factors may be the current tendency of the populate to assign blame instead of taking personal responsibility. And also we are seeing, as many of you may have noticed, a rise of high conflict personalities in the workplace. So to achieve this, again, we have these 4 cornerstones of civility, and these actually come from Forbes magazine, who looked at all of the examples that we have in the media today, and as you all know, there are many. This has been at the forefront of attention for quite some time. The 4 cornerstones are this: to listen to everyone, to speak only after you have thought about what you're going to say and how it might be received. And to also speak up if there is behavior that's disrespectful happening around you. We've done an entirely different webinar on that, on bystander intervention training. I encourage you all to look through that one. The third is respect. And lastly, knowing that, hey, not everyone has to agree. And not everyone has to agree. We're going to talk about that in our third type of training. And these are the ways that everyone goes through it. Now, examples of the 4 cornerstones of civility. How do we actually put those into play? So first one, for example, don't be rude or offensive to your subordinates. Don't be condescending. Respect others' time, respect others' privacy. Don't ask about personal relationships. Don't bring up personal relationships. If you're going to have a phone call, do it in a private area, not in a cubicle next to someone. Those are behaviors that we want to encourage. Another one is, these kind of go hand in hand, but take responsibility. Don't assign blame if something is done wrong, but if there is something that's done good, give credit when credit is due. Other things that are just normal things that everyone would think about, but in looking through the registration questions, there were many, many comments on this next one that I'm going to talk about. Just saying please, saying thank you, good morning, have a good day. Those types of behaviors go such a long way in creating an environment that's positive or creating an environment that's pessimistic and that's negative. Like I said, many of you in your registration questionnaires ask about that. How do we deal with this? Right? So one of the ways is to do civility training, to show how important it is to workplace morale, just to greet everyone with a hello. We have a few other examples. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are quite a lot. Another example is to avoid jumping to conclusions, right? To include everyone. And again, mindfulness, to be self-reflective, to learn your own triggers, to learn your own signs of anxiety, and to learn your areas where you may have potential disagreements, where you may have underlying prejudices, and address those. So civility training focuses on all of those, focuses on these types of behaviors that we have on the screen.
Okay, Jessica, I know we have been discussing civility and what uncivil behavior may look like, but what about when incivility crosses the line into more severe behaviors such as bullying?
Sure. So bullying it's a big deal, and it's one that also we're seeing quite a lot of media attention, and for good reason. It's sometimes very, very difficult to differentiate between incivility and bullying. Now, each case is unique, but bullying is generally repetitive and it's targeted, right? It means something. It means to injure. Whereas incivility maybe is not meant to injure, right? It's jokes, for example. Now, incivility can become bullying if it's let to progress. So workplace bullying, we have a definition here on the screen. Workplace bullying is repeated, it's health-harming mistreatment of one or more persons by one or more perpetrators. So frequently we do see cliques form in the workplace that may have one or more perpetrators. It's very much like bullying experienced in elementary school in some ways. You need to know that bullying is prohibited under many state laws. It is illegal to bully someone, and under the idea that you are responsible for your employees and the actions that they take as an employer, it's also liability that can be passed on to you if you let it continue, if you let it foster, if you let it become something else. And the something else that it becomes, of course, is harassment or is discrimination, and bullying then goes to our protected classes under Title VII. Now, in addition to bullying, there's something else that I think deserves note, and that's rumors as actionable harassment. Now, gossiping, it's just not nice, right? It's definitely uncivil, but we need to look at again that gossiping can violate anti-harassment laws. And actually, just this year, a three-panel judge for the Fourth Circuit found that subjecting a female employee to false rumors that she had slept her way to the top could violate Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And again, Title VII, that's our harassment and our anti-discrimination code, and it could violate Title VII as it pertains to sex or gender. So there we go. Even if it was a joke that she slept her way to the top, it's incivil behavior. If it was not a joke and it was gossip that was allowed to continue, well, then we do have a legal liability problem. And this kind of a rumor in particular, it suggests a double standard that can give rise to this type of gender discrimination claim, because it suggests a double standard whereby if a woman is promoted, she used her sexuality to achieve it, whereas if a man is promoted, he used his abilities, right? So employers really should heed this as a warning that gossip, it can't be tolerated, especially if it's gossip of this form.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. And we have our last poll for today. How diverse do you feel that your workforce is? And we'll give a few moments for our listeners to answer that. Okay, let's go ahead and close that. And here are results. Okay, good, very diverse.
Right, so good to see the leaders there as very diverse and somewhat diverse. So it does look like at least most of our attendees today experienced some diversity in the workplace. So to help out those that were at the not diverse enough level, Jessica, can you help them out and can you discuss inclusion and diversity training and how they can implement that within their workplaces?
Yes, absolutely. Diversity and inclusion training, it's kind of the third type of training that goes hand in hand with the other two, with disability training and with the sensitivity training. As I mentioned when talking about both of those, for example, civility training, it teaches us to look and say, not everyone has the same point of view, and to be okay with that. Diversity training digs further into that, right? So diversity can present itself in many forms, and it is undeniable that diversity creates a more well-rounded and more successful workplace, right? Actually, diverse and inclusive workplaces, the statistics show us that they outperform their peers by 80%. Now, at its most basic, we need to look at what is culture, because culture is what our diversity training is based on. Culture, you have the definition here on the screen. Culture refers to a group or community that shares a common experience. Now, it's easy to say that a culture may be something like race or religion, right? But actually, everyone belongs to many, many types of cultures. Now, some of those are, like I said, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, but things like socioeconomic status, that's a type of culture. Clubs that you may belong to, organizations that someone may belong to, again, type of culture. Even recreational activities. If you like to go play tennis on the weekends, that is also a culture. Political affiliation, again, a culture. So there are so many, these are easy to identify ones, but there are really so many different types of cultures. And something that we also need to keep in mind when talking about culture and diversity training is that cultures are constantly shifting, right? So of course, your race is not going to shift, but things like socioeconomic status, that may shift. Things like where you live, that's also a shifting culture. If you move to a different region, the culture shifts, right? If someone maybe suffers a long-term illness, they can't play tennis anymore, well, now they have the culture of no longer playing tennis and also being disabled. Or if someone undergoes a life-defining moment, have a child, for example, well, your culture changes. And culture is what influences the ways that every person experiences life. And it influences the ways that every person approaches problems. And those things, the experience, the approaches, are directly translatable to the workplace. As I mentioned, it is absolutely undeniable that a more diverse workplace is better for the bottom line, right? It's better for performance, but there are many benefits of a diverse workforce. And we have several on this slide here. Different communication styles, that's a benefit, even though sometimes it may be frustrating. Different attitudes towards conflict, that is an enormous benefit. Different approaches to completing tasks, ways to think outside of the box, different attitudes towards disclosure, and what we mean here is different attitudes towards how much someone may talk about themselves. And that can go back and tie in with our civility training. Do we have personal conversations, right? How much does someone want to disclose? When does it become prying to ask about them? And it also different approaches to knowing. And all of these together, they can translate to higher revenues, greater innovation, better decision making, increased job retention, and better performance. So, while a diverse and inclusive workforce is undeniably beneficial, not all employees are so eager to work on diverse and inclusive teams. And not all employees are very eager to consider the ideas or opinions of cultures or of people that are contrary to their own. And that's especially true when those ideas are rooted in cultural differences, or where there's a predisposed bias or a predisposed stereotype against an individual or against a culture. Now, even when there's no preformed idea, when faced with an interaction that's different, when faced with someone that's unknown, it is human nature to label that difference as wrong, as not correct, instead of questioning our own ideas, instead of questioning our own assumptions. And that's what diversity training gets to. Diversity training looks at how a team can be accepting and inclusive. Even though problems may still arise, those are generally going to be related to communication if we have properly trained a team to be accepting. Now, diverse backgrounds, of course, they bring different languages. That's an easy example. And so team members are frequently working in a language that's not native to them, especially at large companies, especially at IT companies, for example. But imperfect language skills, they can lead to their becoming prejudiced against a person. That's regardless of that person's actual abilities to perform the work, right? And also, miscommunication arises from diverse backgrounds. So, for example, let's contrast the differences between the extreme politeness of the Brits and the directness of the Dutch, right? Two very, very different communication styles. And I'm sure in your workforces, you can find communication styles that are very different. So by understanding those communication styles, by focusing on them, we begin to remove bias, we can remove stereotypes, and employees can approach and respect drastically different points of view. So in practice, really some specific examples that diversity trainers focus on. One, as we talked about, communication strategies. Secondly, learn from generalization, right? Sometimes predisposed ideas are good in the way that they can inform how someone can react to someone else, right? How, for example, working with a Japanese coworker or client should be done. But we don't want to stereotype. We must make sure that everyone is unique and that everyone is treated as unique. Of course, be sensitive and mindful. That goes back to our sensitivity training. Always try to see from another perspective, especially when it comes to breakdown in communication. And don't assume the worst. We talked about that before. Respect the choices of another individual. We have, again, I think on the next slide, a couple more examples. I won't go through all of them because they're more just really actionable things that the trainers suggest. Some things that are very important to fostering, or not to fostering, but to even getting a diverse workforce. And these were some questions that I saw in the pre-webinar registration questions that people submitted. Sometimes people said, how do we get a more diverse workforce? How can we ensure that that's happening? Well, one of the things that can be done is to use very gender neutral language, use very race neutral language in job solicitations, have screenings, the initial screenings at least, be blindly conducted. And we don't want to allow culture fit to be a reason for rejection. What is culture fit? A lot of employers, a lot of HR people focus on that. But culture fit, there's no one culture, as we said. Yes, a culture could be a positive workforce, of course, but we want to consider more what are the benefits that these diverse cultures can bring to us? Another one is adding non-traditional holidays to the company calendar. I love that. It lets everyone feel included, and it's a very small and easy thing to do.
Yeah, that's definitely a good one. Thank you for reviewing this information with us, Jessica. Do you have any final compliance tips and strategies for employers?
As always, I do. So here are my 5 top tips. First, company culture starts at the top. I always say this. A workplace is only as good as those who lead it. On that same token, hold everyone accountable. Systems should be in place to require accountability among all employees, regardless of the position. We frequently see that it's higher level employees who are the most incivil, who are the most disrespectful. We cannot allow that to happen. Policies and procedures are key, of course. Policies must be in place because they are the first line of defense against harassment. They let the employees know what they should do, where they should go, and all employees need to be educated on the policies. We need to update them very frequently. We need to institute new trainings. We need to do refresher trainings. And that's the 4th one there. Investigate new training initiatives. Like I just told the client that I mentioned earlier in this webinar, hey, there are some new trainings. They are great. Let's implement them so that you don't have a similar situation occur again, or so that the situation doesn't get any worse. So, of course, this doesn't mean that those take the place of our anti-harassment or our anti-discrimination trainings, and those in many jurisdictions actually are required by law. These are just a great thing to put and to make a more comprehensive package on your trainings. And lastly, take responsibility. Everybody has a role to play in preventing and stopping harassment. Think about listening to the bystander intervention training on how to prevent and stop it if you see if you see it happening. And every employee should be encouraged to do his or her part to become part of the solution and to promote a culture of respect. And if it's not happening, to say it's not happening and to speak up.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for that presentation. It was very insightful, and I hope that our attendees today got something out of it. In fact, I'm sure that they did. But before we end today's session, I want to take a moment to answer some of the questions from our audience that were submitted. Most of these were submitted during our pre-registration, so it seems like you did a very good job today during the presentation. We didn't get too many questions, but that's not to discourage anyone. If you do have any last-minute questions, go ahead and get them now. If we aren't able to answer them now, we'll make sure that Jessica does receive them. But moving forward to the Q&A session, um, Jessica, I have the question here from an audience member. Can someone else report harassment on someone else's behalf if they see someone getting touched and they do not want to report it? So the gist of the question, is it possible for someone to report harassment or any other issues of incivility or on the behalf of someone else if they're not directly affected or if they aren't the victim?
Absolutely. Again, that kind of goes hand in hand with that bystander intervention training, but it also should be part of your handbooks. You need to make sure that everyone knows that they have a part to play. If someone sees harassment happening, they have to report it. And you should make it very clear also, though, that that person will be protected. This is a reason that many people don't report harassment, either harassment that's happening to themselves or harassment that they see happening in the workplace. And we can say harassment, but I'm including here disrespect, I'm including incivility, I'm including all the things we talked about in this webinar. People don't report it because they fear that their name will be released. They fear that they will be retaliated against, especially if it involves a manager or someone higher up. They fear that they're going to be socially ostracized in the workplace, etc. So the best way to open the door to allowing everyone to report harassment is to say and make it very clear, nothing will happen, right? We will keep it as confidential as we can. Sometimes the name has to be released just for the investigation, but you really need to say, do it, report it, encourage the reporting.
Thank you so much for answering that question, Jessica. And the questions are just funneling in now, so we'll get through as many as we can. But obviously, we'll send them to you at the end of today's presentation, so that way you can respond to them via email, and we'll send that out if your question isn't able to be answered live today. I do want to address again a couple questions about receiving the presentation. It will go out to all attendees and anyone that registered after today's presentation. You'll receive it via email, not only the PowerPoint presentation, but also an audio recording of what you heard today. So just moving forward, I have a question here. It says, who's responsible for addressing toxic behaviors if the supervisors refuse to deal with it?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and that's one that we see very frequently, because a lot of the time these toxic behaviors, they can come from higher up, right? That the company culture, I said don't say company culture just a few minutes ago, but the company culture, as it were, is greatly influenced by managers. And so if a manager refuses to deal with the behavior, it must be set out in your policies and procedures who the next person to report to is, right? It may be that the manager doesn't address it, that you don't feel comfortable addressing it. And I know another one of the questions was, well, what if it's someone in HR that is the person that is sort of perpetuating the toxic behavior, who's a harasser, et cetera. Your policies and procedures have to say who to send that to. So it may be that you send it to that person's manager. It may be that you send it to the CEO. It may be that you send it to the board, right? But your policies should set that out. And if there's no one to send it to, what happens? It gets sent to the EEOC, or you get a lawsuit directly, and that's not what we want, right? So make sure that your policies and procedures do set forth very clearly, here's what the steps are to report it. If someone is involved in step number 1 or 2, skip those, go to step number 3.
Thanks again, Jessica, and also thank you for incorporating the answer, because we did have a question about HR and if the problem was coming from there, but it seems like you did address that as well. But sort of in the same vein, but a little different here, we want to also make sure that anyone that is being accused is also protected as well, right? Because that's important for people, for anyone in that situation. So I have a question here. They ask about a flow chart of action, if that would be a good suggestion if there's an accusation, so as to protect the accuser and the accused until the investigation is finished. So if you can discuss that process of how to protect both parties until there's an answer or some type of resolve that comes from the complaint.
Yeah, sure. And this actually is also going back to the poll question that we had earlier, where I think that most of the attendees said that their response is to have an informal discussion, right? How it really should go, though, is that we want to take the complaint and treat it seriously. Because if it's not treated seriously, what can happen? The behavior doesn't stop, the accuser doesn't feel as though it was taken seriously, they go to the EEOC, and now because you knew of the behavior, then you're also, I'm sorry, now because the company knew of the behavior, the company is also then going to be responsible for allowing the behavior to continue. So we want to take it seriously. How do you take it seriously? You want to note that there's been an accusation. You want to interview the accuser. You want to interview the accused. You must interview any witnesses, get any documentation that there is, and then do a report on it. The report does not go in that person or those people's personnel files. And this question specifically mentioned, how do we protect the accuser and the accused? One thing that I like to do, and that I think is a good strategy, have someone work from home. Okay, not because they're in trouble, and you want to always lead with that. No one is in trouble. We're just investigating it. We're doing our job to protect you, to protect the company. But have somebody work from home until the report is finished. okay, because we don't want to allow that behavior to get even worse, especially when it comes to disrespectful behavior or incivil behavior or toxic behavior. If it's a toxic person, they can try to fix it. And by fixing it, their incivility is even more on display. It just makes things worse. So maybe have them work from home, move offices if possible, separate them as much as we can. And of course, think about how to protect even the names, right? Some instances you do have to disclose who the reporting person is, and that can be challenging. In other instances, maybe you don't. Maybe it's something that can be handled by having that conversation with the person and saying there have been complaints. But if it's a serious accusation, if it's something that you get in writing, for example, we want to make sure that we follow all of those steps. And there's a great presentation that you can listen to, which I did, which is the investigative steps when there's been a harassment or discrimination claim, and you can access that through Personnel Concepts.
Awesome, thank you. And I just have a few more questions here. I think we've touched on some of the topics. We're getting generally the same type of questions. A few about, hey, how do you make a complaint if it's about your boss? I think you've kind of gone through that as far as accessing the policies, going straight to HR and things like that. Of course, we will still submit it to you to make sure that it is answered directly. The question, though, that I do want to pose, because I think it's somewhat unique. Um, It says here it's Vicky from our audience says she was recently told that offsite actions of employees can be addressed if the employees feel threatened or affected on the work site. Do you have any insight on that, how to address offsite actions and how those can play into like workplace incivility claims?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. So just to make sure here, is it, for example, the concern is a group of coworkers, I don't know, go out to a bar after work and there is a comment made? I'm not sure if that's
Right.
what
So
the
that's the way
question
I
is.
interpreted it. Maybe there was a group of employees that participated in some actions that maybe got back to the workplace, or maybe if it was a social media post, something that took place outside of the work where employees can possibly be affected. Would Is that something that can come into a play for like an incivility claim?
Gosh, you know, social media posts, they sure stir up many things in the workplace, don't they? So it is something that can come back, right? Everyone is connected. Everyone is going to know what happened. It's, whether a workplace is toxic is not just at the workplace, right? People don't forget bad behaviors. People are not able to easily partition off things that happen outside of work and things that happened in work. If someone is feeling harassed, if someone is feeling discriminated against, that is going to be, it doesn't matter if it's in the workplace or if it's outside of the workplace. As someone in HR, though, or as a manager, you do have a bit of a difficult position there because it's not your responsibility, it's not your business to talk about what people may be doing outside of work. Of course, you don't want to invade those people's privacy, but at the other hand, if it is affecting the workplace, you need to have the conversation.
Thank you. And just one last question, and hopefully we can get a quick response here. I think I may know the answer, but of course, want your expertise and tips when it comes to the question here from Ricardo. He asks, how do I respond to my manager who is extremely sensitive and makes employees feel like they're walking on eggshells around her? So this is, and it doesn't even have to be specific to a manager. Maybe someone is working with another employee that is sensitive, and they're doing their best to walk around on eggshells around them. But what would you suggest to them? Any tips to how to start that conversation, or and what's any best practices to address this within their workplace?
Yeah, so that's something that we actually have come up in the law a lot, and not just in the employment situation. We call it the eggshell plaintiff. And as I mentioned, if we look back at what the definition of harassment is, harassment goes to what a reasonable person may experience, what a reasonable person may feel in the workplace. If someone is overly sensitive, then they may be just overly sensitive, and there's not a lot that you can do about that. If they're overly sensitive, it may not give rise, their experience may not give rise to harassment, but you need to realize that we do have to take people how they come in the law. A reasonable person, that's a pretty broad definition, right? Many reasonable people are sensitive. So I think the conversation and something that can be done is to do, for example, the sensitivity training, the incivility training, looking at why we or this person may be overly sensitive. What are the triggers there? Why are the reasons that we're so sensitive? And seek with that person to address those, right? We don't want to say we're only doing this training for you because you're overly sensitive, but we can implement it. That would be a great thing to do, and that would be a great way to address this problem.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. And then just lastly, we did get a question from Jess. She asked if we suggest online training. So I just wanted to let her know that we do have both workplace civility training programs and harassment and discrimination prevention training programs here with Personal Concepts. Your subscription may already allow you to access those. So we'll reach out to you to make sure that if you do have access, that we'll get make sure that you can get into those and log in and utilize those products. And if not, we'll tell you how you can get a hold of those. But unfortunately, we have run out of time, and all unanswered questions will be forwarded to Jessica via email. And her responses will be sent out to all attendees in the next coming days. I want to thank everyone who submitted question about today's topic, and thanks to Jessica for taking the time to answer them.
Sure, thank you. It's always fun.
Absolutely. And we enjoy hosting webinars for our valued customers. And as such, we'd really appreciate your feedback. So please stick around a couple minutes as a brief survey will open for you to rate what you saw and heard today. And this concludes today's webinar.
Thank you for attending our presentation. We hope you found this information useful in establishing training to prevent workplace harassment and toxic behaviors. Thanks again to Jessica for being our guest panelist. We look forward to continuing to work with Jessica on future presentations. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to view past webinars on demand at the link provided on the screen. To all of our attendees, thanks for choosing Personnel Concepts as your provider of workplace compliance solutions. Have a good afternoon, everyone.